Welcome back to the show, guys. So a trove of bills, of anti-protest bills, are sweeping the nation. And I want to go over some of these with you. This one is just from the New York Times. We all know about this one, that the GOP bills that are targeting protesters here. You got in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis signed sweeping legislation this week that toughened existing laws governing public disorder and created a harsh new level of infractions, a bill he's called the strongest anti-looting, anti-rioting, pro-law enforcement piece of legislation in the country. Says right here, while Democrats seized on Mr. Floyd's death last May to highlight racism and policing and other forms of social injustice, Republicans responded to a summer of protests by proposing a raft of punitive new measures governing the right to lawfully assemble. GOP lawmakers in 34 states have introduced 81 anti-protest bills during the 2021 legislative session, more than twice as many proposals as in any other year, according to Ellie Page, a senior legal advisor at the International Center for Nonprofit Law, which tracks legislation limiting the right to protest. So that is, so we're going to kind of break down these bills here, that there's a variety of these bills that have been going around the country. Where did I put it? Oh, you're kidding me. Somehow I've lost it. Hold on one second, guys. I will find it. I want to show you these various different bills. Oh, here we go. Here it is. Okay. So this is a great resource that everybody should kind of bookmark here. This is the U.S. Protest Law Tracker. So this actually goes through all the various different sort of anti-protest laws that are being passed state by state. Talk about a freedom of and an infringement on our freedom of expression, an infringement on our ability to voice our dissent. Now, look, nobody's for rioting. Nobody's for looting. That's already a crime. It's already a crime to do all of that. Plenty of people over the summer, by the way, were arrested for looting and for damage of public property, for all of those things. People were arrested. They're already crimes. We don't need to make new laws to create, to make something that's already criminal a crime. Now, a lot of states, a lot of cities chose not to charge, chose not to go after people. That is something totally different. If a state is not going to go after them, then, I don't know what we do about that. And certainly these anti-protest laws that are being passed in places like Tennessee, a place like Tennessee, of course, is going to go after rioters. Of course, they're going to go after looters. Of course, they're going to go after people who hurt other people. That's obvious. But what is a law in Tennessee or a law in Florida going to do for places like Oregon, where they're not choosing to do anything about people that have taken over certain swaths of areas of the city? So all of this is extremely redundant. These things are already illegal. But what these bills do is they expand what is considered illegal. So something that would be normally a misdemeanor, something like trespassing, they're claiming, oh, now this is a felony, and now you're going to potentially go to prison for 5 years if you step foot on a piece of property that you don't even know is actually the property of like a big oil and gas company. So here are some of the actual anti-protest bills. We're going to go over this here. So we do have, these are the 30, there are 30 enacted actual laws, ones that have actually been passed. Now, there's plenty that are actually still attempting to be passed. I think we can do a little search here and we could say pending right here, apply that filter. And what do we get? It says that there's 98 actually of just pending. Let's look at just pending. 68 pending laws and 30 that have actually been passed, signed into law by the governor. So let's go ahead and look at the 30, some of the 30. We don't have time to go through all of them. We'll kind of look at a few of them to see what kind of laws are being made across the country to prevent protesters. Here's one in Arkansas. Now, by the way, there's, I think when I counted, 17 states that have actually enacted anti-protest legislation. And of those 17, I believe 4 of those states, they have Democratic governors who signed these anti-protest laws into law. So Arkansas, what they've got here, they have harsh new penalties for protesters around gas and oil pipelines or critical infrastructure. So most of these laws actually were targeting these gas and oil pipelines and other critical infrastructure for gas and oil pipelines. So the law, but it's very broad what they define as critical infrastructure. So the company's headquarters, for example, the headquarters where they have offices, some of these laws make it to where you're not allowed to even protest outside of their headquarters. That's considered critical infrastructure. So, which is insane. You should be able to protest an oil and gas company outside of their headquarters. But, apparently that's going to be a felony in some states. It says here that under the law, purposefully entering or remaining on any critical infrastructure is a Class D felony, punishable by up to 6 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Separately, the law provides that trespassing on property outside of a city or town, regardless of whether it is posted, is a Class D felony if the property is critical infrastructure. In nearly all other cases in Arkansas, trespassing is a misdemeanor or a minor violation. It also creates a felony offense for anyone who purposefully and unlawfully causes damage to critical infrastructure and any amount of damage which the law does not define. So they say anything like painting, so if you spray paint on, an oil and gas company's pipe, then you are now a felon and you're facing 20 years in prison and a $15,000 fine. I mean, do you think that the punishment fits the crime? 20 years in prison. I mean, look, Derek Chauvin isn't even going to get 20 years in prison. So that's why these laws are a bit absurd, because they create an environment that, they're obviously saying you're not allowed to. Now, look, I'm not for vandalizing. I'm not for any of these things. So I understand the desire to make but it's already illegal. So to make this illegal on top of illegal is insane. To make it beyond a misdemeanor and to say, well, no, if you spray paint the site of the oil and gas company's headquarters, you're now a felon, not just somebody who's getting a misdemeanor like you would if you were to do it anywhere else. This will also create a situation where somebody maybe doesn't realize what they're spray painting, right? And they're like just tagging something and they don't really, they're not an activist. They don't care. They're not even thinking of it. But because it happened to be an oil and gas company's piece of property, suddenly that person is facing 20 years in jail. Florida. Now, this is the one that that's making the big news. So this one is definitely insane because this allows somebody to drive into protesters, potentially kill the protesters without any sort of consequences to that, which is crazy. It says here that it enlarges the legal definition of riot, a third-degree felony, to include any group of 3 or more individuals whose shared intent to engage in disorderly and violent conduct results in imminent danger of property damage or personal injury or actual damage or injury. Notably, the new definition does not require that the individual's conduct be disorderly or violent. So in Florida now, all they have to prove is, well, you wanted to do it. And because you wanted to do it, you're now going to be held responsible. This seems really hypocritical to me, considering people in Florida and Ron DeSantis, for example, were, they did not agree with the impeachment of Donald Trump, saying that he incited violence. They said, oh, how could he didn't do anything to actually incite a riot. So how could he be charged with that? How could he be impeached with this? And yet here's Florida making this exact law. Talk about being a hypocrite. It says here that under the new law, a riot consisting of 25 or more people or one that endangers the safe movement of a vehicle is automatically an aggravated riot, which is a new second-degree felony offense under the law. As such, large groups of protesters or ones that block traffic, even temporarily, could face up to 15 years in prison. Under the new law, inciting someone to participate in a riot is a third-degree felony, punishable by 5 years in prison. The law also creates a new criminal offense of mob intimidation, defined as a group of 3 or more people who act with a common intent to compel or attempt to compel another person to do or refrain from doing any act, or assume, abandon, or maintain a particular viewpoint against their will. The offense is a first-degree misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in jail. The law creates a new third-degree felony offense, punishable by up to 5 years in prison, for anyone who willfully and maliciously defaces, injures, or otherwise damages any means, statues, flags, paintings, displays, or any other memorials, and the value of the damage is more than $200. So you can't, tag something or deface something, anything like that. You're going to go to jail, up to 5 years in prison. So if you apply paint or graffiti to a monument in the course of a peaceful protest, you could face 5 years in prison. Finally, the law creates a new civil right of action against a municipal government that fails to respond appropriately to protect persons and property during a riot or unlawful assembly, making them civilly liable for damages, including personal injury or property damage. These provisions, if enacted, could encourage multiple governments to adopt overly aggressive law enforcement responses to protests in order to avoid lawsuits. So cities now in Florida might say, well, shoot, this could turn into a riot, and so we're going to stop it in advance. We're going to shut down your protest because your protest might turn into a riot. So essentially, and that's kind of the gist of most of these. Indiana's got one where they've got penalties for protests near critical infrastructure. Most of them are about these oil and gas pipelines. Kansas, this is a Democratic governor, signed this one into law. New penalties for protests near gas and oil pipelines. A lot of this was in response to Standing Rock. Kentucky has new penalties for protests near pipelines and other infrastructure. That was also I believe that Kentucky governor is also the one that signed that into law is a Democrat. Louisiana, also Democrat here. Heightened penalties for protesting near a pipeline. So all these are pipeline. Mississippi, new penalties for protesting near critical infrastructure. Missouri, new penalties for protesting near gas and oil pipelines. Missouri, limiting public employees' ability to picket. Oh, this one's interesting. Bars certain public employees from picketing. The law requires that all labor agreements negotiated between a public body and labor organization shall expressly prohibit all strikes and picketing of any kind. The law further mandates that such agreements provided for the immediate termination of any public employee who pickets over any personal matter. Public body is broadly defined. So basically, if you're a public employee, if you work for the city or the state or any public, you're not allowed to picket for anything personal or anything else. So, and it even says picketing is not defined. So they can call anything picketing. They're like, oh, picketing. You're picketing. Well, what am I picketing? I don't even have a picket. Doesn't matter. You're picketing. So that's really interesting. It bars certain public employees from picketing. The law requires that all labor agreements negotiated between. So I'm just trying to understand this because I'm like, are they really actually banning anyone who works for the government or public in Missouri from literally protesting? Like you can't, if you're going to work for the government, work for the public in some way. Interesting. North Dakota, heightened penalties for protesting near critical infrastructure. North Dakota also put this heightened penalties for riot offenses. Increases the penalties imposed for riot offenses. Under the law, participation in a riot is a Class A rather than a Class B misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in prison and $3,000 fine. North Dakota also expanded scope of criminal trespass. So it says that demonstrations or other gatherings on private property, if notice against trespass is clear from the circumstance, the offense could be punishable to up to 30 days in jail. Also, North Dakota has new penalties for protesters who conceal their identity. So, that's interesting. A lot of people conceal their identity in order to protect themselves from sort of retaliation. Obviously, we've seen that used in good and bad ways, right? KKK, they used hoods. They obviously did that, because they were wanting to hide from the fact that they were a bunch of racists. They didn't want anybody to know who they were. But in other times, people use masks or something in order to hide their identity because they don't want the repercussions of, but they want to show support for whatever the cause is. And maybe the cause is a good cause. Ohio, new penalties for protests near critical infrastructure. Oklahoma did penalties for protesters who block traffic and immunity for drivers who hit protesters and liability for organizations that work with protesters. So, I just cannot believe that any state in their right mind would actually make it okay to just run over protesters. You just run them over. I mean, that's just... So you're not allowed to protest in a way that's going to be disruptive. And if you're disruptive, but then it's like, what's the point of your... Sometimes, what's the point of your protest if you're not going, especially as, okay, so this is the real problem with this is, okay, that's fine if your protest is small enough to stay on the sidewalk. But what if your protest grows and swells and the vast majority of the city is the people that live there are suddenly all in agreement against something the government is doing. And let's say everybody in America, imagine this for a second. Now, everybody in America is up in arms over the censorship of big tech. And we go and we protest big tech. We cannot believe all their censorship. And it swells and swells and millions of people turn out. And now if you're in the state of Oklahoma or in Florida even, and you turn out on the streets because there's too many of you to be on the sidewalk, somebody could run you over and it's okay. You got in their way. Again, South Dakota, new penalties for protests near pipelines and other infrastructure. So a lot of these are just pipelines and infrastructure. And Tennessee, so the state, Texas did some around critical infrastructure, West Virginia, Wisconsin. So all of these, this is very alarming that there are these increased penalties for protesting rather than if you're at a protest and the protest gets out of hand and something happens and people break the law, then the rule of law that is in existence is what they have to face. And instead with these anti-protest laws, they're literally upping the ante, making it to where you think twice about protesting. Because if you show up to that protest and somebody near you does something that is, they're looting or they decide to do something and you're not, you're just there for the cause, and somebody else does something, then suddenly you could potentially be held criminally liable for the actions of somebody else because they determine you are an associate of that person in some way. So this is all just a way to control dissent. It's another form of controlling the masses, another form of controlling dissent, and we should all be totally and completely against this. Recently, I went to a protest put on by the Convo Couch for Julian Assange. We marched in the streets. I guess if we were in Oklahoma, somebody could have run us over, and that would have been okay. And that is what our government is spending their time on, that kind of thing. And especially that one, it should be illegal to run somebody over. But they instead say, no, we're going to make it okay if it's a protester. Go ahead and get them. 2 points a person. That's how they're making it a game. So really alarming. What kind of a country are we living in? Is this a free country after all? Looking at these laws and the 68 other laws that are potentially going to be passed against protesters beats me.